Hello, Rainier Avenue Radio App, coming to you live from Seattle's Columbia City Theater. I'm Sam Harris, housing economist and co-founder of SeeKing, an organization examining the homeless situation in the greater Seattle and King County region. Each week, we'll explore an issue at the heart of the problem to find the root causes of homelessness. At the end of the 12 weeks, we will present a unified solution. Week 1, we explored the nature of sweeps with COC co-chair Ruby Romero. I left that conversation feeling that the semblance of control we feel by removing people without providing housing is more than offset by the damage it creates to the people displaced. And in week 2, Joe Malloy focused on changing stigmas about autism, neurodivergence, and disability in the homeless community. It would appear that the trauma of housing loss can exacerbate or trigger mental, physical, and emotional issues that make stabilizing even more challenging. In week 3, we explored the trauma of housing instability and how we can explore and support stabilization for people who have experienced this trauma and reinvigorate hope. With us today is Mike Mathias, Executive Director of Anything Helps and Housing First expert. Thank you, Mike, for being with us today. And perhaps the best place to start is, what exactly is Housing First?
Well, it's a trick question. How you doing, Sam?
Yeah, doing good.
Well, there's two definitions of Housing First. There's the philosophy, and then there's the evidence-based practice or intervention. So, it started as what we all think it is, which is the practice or intervention that has evidence-based behind it that will produce positive outcomes for people experiencing homelessness. And then there is the philosophy, which has kind of been the result of a broadening use of that term. And the result is essentially a mishmash of answers to that question.
Right. Yeah, it feels like Housing First is just kind of thrown around.
Yeah.
And it sounds like anytime somebody puts something in temporary shelter, they'll say Housing First.
Yep.
But it feels like that's maybe not the philosophy. And the philosophy with the best practice is what?
Well, the philosophy is not the best practice.
Oh.
So the philosophy is what our federal guidelines fall under, which allows a Housing First shelter to exist, for instance. However, when you look at the evidence-based practice, it really emphasizes housing with no readiness conditions. And when all your trailheads, to housing start in shelter, then shelter becomes a readiness condition. So we don't have a lot of evidence left of the actual intervention that has positive outcomes anymore, because we've been just mushing that into the ground for so long. But one of the challenges that I think we have today is, and one of the reasons I wanted to be on the show was to kind of emphasize that point and kind of bring us back to what works. And that way we have some added weight against criminalization, because right now we're at a catalyzing point with whether or not Housing First will still be around. So we need to all get on the same page here.
Right. Well, I think the thing that is most unclear is, how do we get people housing ready? If somebody is living in a tent and they're chronically homeless, the mindset has shifted, right? They're in a state of, they've adapted, right? You have to adapt. So once you lose your housing, it's a different world. You're living without security. There's no locked door. There's no address to apply for a job, right? There's no bathroom. There's no closet to store your clothes in. It's a whole different world. How do we get people out of that scenario, without temporary shelter? Because I've always kind of thought of temporary shelter as kind of a staging point.
Mm-hmm.
Get them safe, like the hotels that they were doing at the LEC. You get them in a temporary shelter with the idea that you can prepare them for what they need to have that permanent housing.
Yeah. Well, Well, that's so. So this is a great example because one of the things that both people that don't understand Housing First that advocate for it, and Samson Barris, the founder and creator of Housing First, the practice both agree on is that housing readiness is not something that is a thing, but in practice and in philosophy, there's a very big difference. So when somebody is arguing for the philosophy of Housing First, they will say housing readiness, housing is a human right. People should be given that, whether, we feel like they're ready or not. Everybody's ready for housing, yada, yada. And that's true. However, when you look at the practice, it involves a multidisciplinary treatment team, optional to the client to use, but required for the program to implement. And that is weekly visiting the client in their housing. So that is like a psychiatric hospital that is coming to your door every week saying, hey, I'm just checking in. How are things going? That's a mandatory part of the program for the client, just to have the check-in, but they don't have to be required to receive the services that team provides. So when you look at it that way, that statement makes a lot more sense, right? But in practice today, we have 4 of those types of treatment teams coming to the doorsteps of clients with a maximum of, I think, less than 500 people as their caseload. So we can't realize Housing First until we have the interventions that are required to actually run it to the fidelity of its model.
Right. So we need more caseworkers.
We need more
qualified.
We need mobile psychiatric teams in the community to be able to implement things right. Because you're right. What you're saying is absolutely truthful and correct. There needs to be some, assistance to migrate people away from the survival and trauma, mentality that they have been shifting in and out of unstably to reach stability. You're going to need assistance. And I think what Housing First was directly designed to reverse was the staircase model, which is what you're describing, that graduating, staircase model of get into shelter, get off the drugs, get into housing, and then you're done. And what we do today is essentially put people in housing or put people in shelter, put people in housing when it's available, and then leave them alone. And
right. So
it's almost like housing last,
Right. So they're still in a state of instability with their housing.
Yeah. And with their everything,
Right. That makes sense. Well, so I guess the question is, this is a nice little lead into this new program that you're jumping into. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about your tenancy support program.
Sure. Yeah. I will get to that. But I do want to say there are a couple other things that are required for Housing First to work properly. And I do want to touch on that because I just think it's important for people to know. Yeah. Housing First is a 26-point intervention with 26 measurable metrics that we can use to ensure that organizations that are taxpayer money funds are following the evidence base for positive outcomes for clients. I'm a lead fidelity reviewer for the Healthcare Authority for permanent supportive housing. And the eye-opening stat that I can tell you is if we are to advocate for Housing First as a sector and as a response system, we're not advocating for what that is. Because when I look at those 26 points and I measure them and I kind of give the county an average score, it's like 96. And, I think the highest score you can get is like 140, something like that. If that was happening at the Healthcare Authority with the program that I review, that would be a giant red flag. Fidelity isn't meant to be a audit point, but when you're under 100, something's wrong. And I feel like as a county, something's wrong.
So we're attempting to measure success, but what we're actually getting is more of a C+.
We're not even trying to measure success. Like the Our continuum of care doesn't even know what that word means, fidelity. They have no idea.
Why don't you back up a second and explain what the continuum of care is?
Sure, yeah. So in King County, for instance, and really, there are certain regions throughout the United States that are all kind of centralized points for HUD funding, which is federal funding dollars coming down from the government to address housing. The HUD, housing and homelessness, and those dollars do not require any type of fidelity reviewing for the evidence-based practices that they fund. And there's a reason for that. It's usually for housing. It's usually for the housing authorities. It's usually for things related to that. But when you're dealing with people, there's an intervention that needs to be reviewed, and HUD doesn't require that. The healthcare authority does. They've been doing it forever. That's why permanent supportive housing, for instance, is something that we can get fidelity reviews on in the state and in the county. However, when it comes to the fidelity of things like Housing First, there's no guidelines for that. And so the continuum of care, which is the focal point for funding for HUD for our county, for King County, they're not even aware of what fidelity is. And fidelity is essentially that 26-point measurable metric thing that I was talking about.
Right. And so the COC in King County is the King County Regional Homelessness.
Yeah, it's the KCRHA. Yeah, the King County Regional Homelessness Authority.
Yeah. I've always loved that the homeless authority, as if there need to be an authority on homelessness. Feels like they kind of skipped over the housing, right? The stable housing.
They intentionally, in their 5-year plan, pointed out that they are not going to do anything with housing. They were very clear about that in their first, or at least their first and second revision. They were like, anything related to housing, we're not going to deal with.
But aren't they in control of the homeless management information system, which has permanent supportive housing in it?
Yep.
And that doesn't count as housing? That
doesn't count to them as housing, no, because the housing authorities are the ones that regulate all the vouchers, regulate all the other funding, and the state funding and other funding sources. And I think what they were looking to do at that time was to kind of deter responsibility for the actual solution to the issue, because they didn't hold all the contracts and all the control. They didn't want to collaborate with other entities. They were very intentional about that.
Okay, I have 1,000 questions that came from
me too.
The first is permanent supportive housing distributed by HMIS. Isn't that housing? It's permanent. That word is there. Can people not stay there?
What's really funny is that this has the exact same breakdown as Housing First. So there's a philosophy, and then there's a intervention, and neither of them are physical locations. We fund certain buildings, but those buildings are not permanent supportive housing. Permanent supportive housing is an intervention. And there's a misconception that it means housing for, warehousing the poor with services built in. But what you're describing with that is just an inpatient institution, right? You're not talking about permanent supportive housing. So we can go on and deeper with that, but we shouldn't.
Fair. Okay. So a little.
There's a lot of reasons why we are where we are today.
Going on, right? Yeah, that makes sense. So when we get someone in permanent supportive housing, we're still trying to get them into a more permanent, regular space.
It just depends on the person. Some people will graduate out of what's called today permanent supportive housing units. But really, the social mobility is something that is a factor of community integration. So like when you're putting people of the same, level of, income or poverty in the same building, and they're all kind of, dealing with each other's maladaptive social norms that, they've brought with them, off the streets, you're not creating a conducive environment for recovery. And therefore, when you look at PSH, the permanent supportive housing, the actual model, it encourages a separation of housing and services. So you don't want those two things in the same building, and you want to provide people with environments in the community, so they kind of have healthier norms around them to kind of provide peer pressure into kind of normalizing healthier behaviors.
So let's just assume someone has lost their housing.
Mhm.
They can't sleep at night. They started using some inexpensive drugs. You know, we have a lot of really inexpensive, horrible drugs, very addictive. And then we are supposed to just put them into permanent housing before they go to rehab? Or is it something where you can align rehab and when you get out of rehab, you put them into housing? Or is it?
You can do either or. So, it's, the cool thing about Pathways Housing First, which is the original Housing First, practice, is that it's completely client driven. You allow them to determine what's best for them. They are the experts in their own life. And you allow them to decide what they want to do. And if they make mistakes, or if they, end up being, evicted, you, as an advocate or as a case manager, your job is to empower them, allow them to learn from those mistakes instead of, fall completely apart, follow them through that lesson learned and help them grow. So, you don't want to be making those types of determinations for people, especially for a group of people, because everybody kind of has their own like for me, I was homeless for 8 months, unsheltered under a bridge in North Seattle for most of it. And I was able to get out just based on luck, right? The Housing and Essential Needs program out here had sent me mail, and I just happened to have a PO box for 1 more month. And so I got a notification that told me, hey, you're eligible for this program now. I was very fortunate to get out of homelessness. If it wasn't for that, I would still be on the streets today. If I was alive, and I was dealing with addiction, and I was dealing with all of these mental health issues. And that got me off the streets into a micro studio in Redmond, because that was the only place I could find that wouldn't discriminate against me. And so I got into that micro studio, and I continued to use, I continued to have issues. I didn't have any support, but because of the proximity to services, I was able to start utilizing NAMI. I was able to start utilizing the National Alliance for Mental Illness for peer support. And where's Mike D when you need him? I found this love of learning that I just loved learning about psychology and loved learning about, all of these issues that I had and what was really going on. And, I think that it's important to recognize that journey is unique to me, because I can't emulate that for anyone else. And the same can be said about every single person that experiences that trauma. Like, it's going to show differently. So you have to have an intervention that's flexible and allows people to determine their own path.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It doesn't sound like that's necessarily the way it can be set up right now.
It can.
It seems like there's so many silos.
Yeah.
That nobody really works together.
Yeah.
So when you're in one program, it seems like they kind of ostracize you from other programs. So that if this one program can do everything you need, great.
Yeah.
But
rarely is that the case.
Yeah, right. Sometimes it feels like they're saying, "Oh, we need this other thing. Well, we'll just kind of do it."
That's why we follow our clients longitudinally across the servicescape. So we ensure that, wherever our clients go, we go with them, and we advocate for them with other service providers wherever we can. The benefit there is that, you're keeping the relationship. Homelessness is one of the most isolating, lonely, misunderstood experiences in the world. Like, I don't feel like anything can kind of encapsulate or prepare you or, get you to relate to that experience. And so when you are someone that has been there, and you share that with someone, and you kind of share a story with them, you can see it in their eyes. They just click with you right away. They're like, okay, this guy is where I want to be. And he knows exactly what this is. I still have trouble, connecting with people that haven't been through that experience because of the trauma associated with it. It makes you feel safe, working with and dealing with people that have experienced that before.
Yeah.
And I think when it comes to what you were saying about, being able to do it where we currently are, I think the premise that I'm laying out here sounds like I'm saying just throw people to the landlords and let them fail and let the landlords deal with the problems, right? And that's definitely not what I'm saying. What I'm suggesting is that the housing first evidence-based practice requires basically a relationship with that client where they feel safe enough to ask you for that multidisciplinary help that should be checking on them every single week, right? So as you're checking in on them, you're building a relationship with them. They're becoming more familiar with you. They start to trust you. And therefore, they're more likely to engage in the services that you're providing at the time that they're ready, because you're always continuously checking on them. And that's where you see that level of engagement in the actual practice of the correct model. But it requires that team, and I think you can do that. You just need to figure out how to fund it because nobody funds the right things anymore.
Right, and it feels a little bit like funding is one of the primary work orders for most of these organizations, because there's just everybody's competing. It makes them feel a little proprietary, where they don't want to share. Like, that's our grant, right?
We have to protect our funding. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so I still have a little bit of misunderstanding when it comes to a landlord taking on someone with these underlying conditions coming straight from homelessness. Let's just say I had an apartment and this person would apply normally. Is that it, just a normal application? And why would that landlord, after doing a credit check, why would they ever take you?
They wouldn't. And that's where we are today, right? So like, if we don't have that multidisciplinary team coming and checking on people, then you're basically saying, hey, landlord, here is a deeply troubled person that I want you to take in as a tenant, and I'm going to provide you with no support and good luck. Who would ever do that? It doesn't make any sense, but that's exactly what we do today. And we expect them to want, incentives or, some type of, risk mitigation that's most definitely going to be needed. That's not what landlords want to help. They want to help with this issue.
You've got to figure out a way to counter the risk.
You need to provide them with the same thing that another tenant would provide them with: passive income.
Yeah,
stable passive income. And there's no, I may not agree with the way our economics work today, but I can acknowledge where we are. And, if you want to open up more units for people experiencing homelessness, you need to have the experience for the landlord be as similar as that experience as possible. You want to make that almost universal. And you can do that if you're providing the right support. And that's what we do now with our Tenant Success Network. Now, landlords will call me when they have units available, and they'll say, hey, I've got a unit. Do you have anybody? They'll lower screening criteria for my clients. They'll do whatever it takes, because they know that not only are they getting, a tolerable situation into their units, but they're also getting guaranteed money from the government. Right?
Countering the risk. It's perfect.
Yes. Yeah. And usually we just lead with that guaranteed money from the government, and we don't factor in the risk associated, the perceived risk associated with renting to a lower income tenant that landlords have to factor in because of damages and problems with their other tenants that may occur because of that tenant. These are very real situations, and it's not the fault of any individual person. It's just trauma has a way of making things very abnormal for you. And, you need that treatment available to you at your door every week.
Right.
And
so people can get into their housing.
Yeah.
Feel like they can get their feet under them, get that balance, start creating their own income, and eventually become stable.
Yeah. Integrated is what we call it. Just feel like you're part of the community again.
Yeah. I like to call it putting into the industry, right? A stable person pays into the system.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. You're contributing to society.
That's it seems like that should be the end all goal, is to stabilize everybody's housing stability for all.
Well, that's the top of Maslow's hierarchy, right? Self-actualization, purpose. That's what we all should be striving to achieve, is figuring out what we can contribute to the world that will be here when we're gone.
Right. Perfect. Well, this takes us to that next step, where your tenancy support program. I want to hear more about that before we run out of time. Your tenancy support program. At what point can people reach out to you, and how do they know about it?
So our Tenant Success Network is an initiative designed to provide some light touch case management to people that are recently housed that were formerly homeless all over the state of Washington. The goal is to essentially do this by paying the existing workforce a supplementary wage. So there's a disparity in social work wages that we hear about all the time. And there's an accumulation of tenancy issues that continue to occur in the market for formerly homeless renters that, with some light touch case management can be addressed. So our goal is to essentially match case managers out there with 5 recently housed tenants in their zip code. And if they are able to see them once a week or talk to them on the phone once a week, just check on them, make sure that they're doing okay, then we can pay them a supplementary wage for that. And we're also starting what's called a tenant success line, which will be for landlords and for tenants as well. So they can call and get extra support for more complex issues. Perfect.
Well, looks like we're running out of time here, but any last comments? You want to give yourself a plug?
Go to our website, anything-helps.org. You can reach out to me, Mike, at anything-helps.org, if there's anything that you want to learn more about.
Okay, thank you so much, Mike. That's it for Seeking Change this week. I'm Sam Harris. Thanks for listening. Stay tuned for Seattle Here and Now.